Okay, the purpose of this video is to go over some writing reminders and to go over some writing skills that I'm going to expect to see from you in your essays. This document may look very familiar. That's because I went over it with you guys when you guys were going to write your final exam essay for first semester. This sample is actually all geared towards the first semester essay, but all of the same writing skills still apply. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at it. The first thing we're going to start with is MLA format. You notice over here on the left-hand side, we have what we like to call the heading. And the heading includes your name, my name, the class, and then the date formatted as the number, which you can just put the due date if you want. I don't really care too much about that. The month written out completely, do not abbreviate. And then the year written out completely as well. Obviously, yours would be 2020. Okay, so the heading is in the upper left-hand corner. Over here in the upper right-hand corner, we have what's called the header. And the header includes your last name and a page number. Make sure that it is actually a page number, because if it's not a page number, then on page 2 it would still say 1. But here we have something that actually says 2, so that means it's an actual page number. Okay, couple MLA reminders too. First of all, everything has to be double spaced. Everything also has to be in Times New Roman font. Everything also has to be indented in terms of your paragraphs. Okay, indent. Oh, and when I say double spaced, no extra spaces between lines. Okay, so that's kind of some basic MLA format stuff, especially when you get set up for the top of your document. But remember, guys, before you actually get to your essay, you're actually going to start with your outline, okay? So remember that comes first. So the heading here will go on the same page as the outline, and that's it. You do not have to repeat the heading after that. I should only see one heading on your document. It should be on the first page, which would be your outline. Okay, the header, that goes on every single page. That should be a running header throughout your document. Okay, for your outline, you guys know you only need a label, but for your essay, you need to have what we like to call a creative title. Basically, just something that doesn't include the word essay in it. Okay, I'm not gonna get too crazy with you when it comes to like what you title your essay. I love a good creative title. They make me smile, they make me laugh, but I'm not gonna get super picky when it comes to that, just as long as you have some sort of title other than essay. Okay, so let's move on. Let's look at the intro paragraph. Okay, so this intro paragraph here, it has 3 components to it that I need to see, and some of it I gave you an example, some of it I didn't. Just so you know too, anything that's bolded here on the essay would not actually be bolded in your essay. Okay, you do not have to bold those sentences. The sentences in bold are sample sentences for you. Okay, so please do not bold anything on your actual essay. So, starting with a hook. So number 1 is a hook. Of course, the first thing I'll do is start my essay with an interesting hook to grab the reader's attention. As a reminder, what are some ways you can hook your reader? You can start with an interesting quote. You can have a short anecdote. You can have an original metaphor. And then you can also start with a thought-provoking question. Now remember, on the thought-provoking question, not to make it a dumb, obvious question. You obviously don't want to have a question that can be answered with yes or no. You also don't want it to be too on the nose. Please don't ask me the question of the prompt as your hook. Okay? You guys are the ones who are going to answer the question in the prompt, so don't give the question in the prompt as your hook. Okay, so number 1 is a hook. That's what I need to see first in your introduction paragraph. Next, I'll start to transition and narrow down my topic. So that's the second thing I'm going to see. Ultimately, the transition sentences lead toward the thesis, and that's the third thing I need to see. Okay, so in your intro paragraph, you should have a hook, transition sentences which lead directly into your thesis, which of course is your most important sentence. Okay. Notice that it says I'll end my introduction with a thesis that addresses all aspects of my prompt or of the prompt without simply listing my body paragraph ideas. Remember that you don't want to do that. Okay. This was a transition sentence here into my thesis. In some ways, American values are paradoxical. And then here, I actually give you a sample thesis. So let's look at that sample thesis. This, again, is from the first semester prompt. It says, American literature stresses the celebration of individuality, but it also suggests a strong push for collective justice for all of those individual persons equally. If you remember, there are actually 3 ideas within this sentence, but notice that I don't just say Americans value individuality, justice, and equality, right? I didn't just list those in order, bam, 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 although all 3 are technically included within my sentence. You guys should be good at this by now, where you are kind of have more sophisticated phrasing, so you should be able to clearly communicate the ideas of your essay without simply listing them, okay? Let's move on to the body paragraph, because again, as a review, your intro needs to have these 3 things. Okay, the hook, the transition to the thesis, or transition and then the thesis. Your body paragraph. I started again, it's in bold, but I gave you a sample topic sentence. Okay. It says, the Romantic movement, one of the major shifts in American literature, presses the idea that an essential part of American identity is the celebration of the power of the individual. First of all, notice that your topic sentence is an idea. It's not just stating the different movements that you're going to use, although in this one it does actually acknowledge it. But notice it says an essential part of the American identity is the power of the individual. Okay, and if I were to go back to my thesis, does it mention the power of the individual in my thesis? Yeah, right here. Right? If you scroll down and go to my next topic sentence, it says, based on Arthur Miller's The Crucible and Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, it's clear that Americans value justice and are disappointed in instances of injustice. So then if I go back to my thesis, does it mention justice in my thesis? Yeah, right there. Notice that your topic sentences relate directly back to your thesis. Everything in your paper should ultimately support what you're saying in your thesis. If I were to go to my third topic sentence, just down here, it says, Americans value both individuality and justice, but Harlem Renaissance literature and the main plot of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn show that Americans also value individuality of all persons and seek equality through just treatment. Once again, if I go back up to my my thesis, does it mention equality? Yeah, it does. So all 3 of my topic sentences ultimately relate back to my thesis, and that's really, really important. Okay, so back to my first body paragraph here and kind of the components that need to be there. The first thing you need to have is your topic sentence. Okay. Then it says, I'll give a little bit of context for my example. So that's the second thing we need to see. Leading into the delivery of my actual quote. So the second thing I need to see in your paragraph is context. Okay? After my contextual lead-in, okay, I'll provide the quote, and then it would be something like, hey, quote number 1 for the paragraph. And that's the third thing you need, which is an actual example. Notice with my quote, I do give a contextual lead-in, okay, so that goes back to the idea of context. I do have some form of quote integration, meaning my quote is not just standing alone by itself as a complete sentence. It's integrated into my own words. And then again, we end with a parenthetical citation, which should be the last name of the author, and a page number, which you should have both for every single source that you use. Maybe not the O'Connor text. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at that. Okay? After each quote, I'll make sure to give a little bit of analysis. Okay, that's the fourth thing we need to see. That connects the quote given to the idea in my topic sentence and ultimately my thesis in my introduction paragraph. I will lightly transition to my next example. Okay, so next thing you need to do is transition to next example. Okay. and then give context for that example. Okay, so more context is needed as well. So 5 and 6 would be transition and some context for your second example. At this point, you're pretty much going to be repeating because it says again, after my contextual lead-in, I'll provide the quote itself, and it should be fully integrated. Quote number 2 for the paragraph with a parenthetical citation. So again, the next thing I need to see is the actual example. I'm just going to put example number 2, and again, that can either be a quote or it can be just some sort of reference to the text. What is important is that you have at least one direct quote per paragraph. Okay, so if you have 2 quotes, that's fine, but at least one of your examples, either quote number 1 or quote number 2, has to be a direct quote. Okay, once again, this part's repeated here, but it says after each quote, I'll make sure to give a little bit of analysis. Okay, that connects the quote given to the idea in my topic sentence, and ultimately my thesis in my introduction paragraph. Finally, the last thing I need to see in your body paragraph is another kind of transition. It says, finally, I'll smoothly transition to my next paragraph idea. Okay, so earlier the transition was about to my next example. Now we're looking at, I'm going to be transitioning to my next idea. Okay, so as far as body paragraphs go, you need about 9 things, but the good news is it's kind of repeated. You have to have a topic sentence, okay? You have to have context for your first example. You have to give the example, either a quote or some sort of reference to the work. You need to analyze that example. You need to transition very quickly to your next example. Give more context, but this time for your example number 2. Give your example number 2 and then analyze it. And then ultimately transition to your next paragraph or idea. Technically, this part can be repeated, right here, for a third example if you'd like to do so, okay? All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and show you what that looks like. I'll give you a full kind of sample paragraph here of my actual writing, okay? So the first thing we see, of course, is the topic sentence. I'm going to highlight that in yellow real quick so we can see it. Okay, so the sample topic sentence says, based on Arthur Miller's The Crucible and Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, it's clear that Americans value justice and are disappointed in instances of injustice. And so what the topic sentence does is tells us what the rest of the paragraph is going to be about. So based on this topic sentence, I can tell already that this paragraph is going to be about how Americans value justice and are disappointed in instances of injustice. Okay, so we started with our topic sentence. The next thing we're going to see is context, and so I'm going to highlight some as I read. Arthur Miller's The Crucible tells the failure of the justice system to protect the innocent. Amidst false accusations of witchcraft, not only does the court in Salem blindly side with the manipulative accusers, it also condemns people with little to no evidence. Reverend Hale admits that there is a prodigious fear of this court in the country while pleading on behalf of Giles Corey. Okay, so all of that right there is actually context. Okay, and I'm going to underline a few things here too. It says Reverend Hale admits that while pleading on behalf of Giles Corey. That right there is called a contextual lead-in, and it's also my form of quote integration. Okay, because then I introduce myself into the quote. Okay, so Reverend Hale admits that, and then I'm going to go ahead and give the quote itself. There is prodigious fear of this court in the country. Okay, and that comes from Arthur Miller's The Crucible on page 90. Okay, so here I have the quote itself. So this is quote number 1. Okay. And here I have what I call the parenthetical citation, or PC. Okay, notice that my quote integration and my contextual lead-in, it really just blends into one sentence. So you've got Reverend Hale admits that there is a prodigious fear of this court in the country while pleading on behalf of Giles Corey. So my form of quote integration here is really just part of my sentence. Okay. Next, what comes after your actual quote would be your analysis. So let's go ahead and take a look at that here. Reverend Hale was someone who was initially in agreement with the accusers, but when he recognizes that many people are not receiving true justice, he changes his tune and begins to protect the innocent. Although this is an instance of injustice, it actually demonstrates that Americans value justice. The entire story is frustrating to the readers, and the author clearly has a negative opinion of injustice, showing that justice is actually valued by Americans. Okay, so that was a lot there, but this is my analysis of example 1. Notice too, look at the kind of ratio of green and blue to orange. Okay, the orange is the actual quote, but notice how much more I have of green and how much more I have of blue. Okay, your analysis and your words should far outweigh your actual quote. Okay, also notice in my analysis, I talk about why this is so important. I said, hey, this guy, he says there's a prodigious fear of this court in the country, and now I'm explaining why that relates back to justice. Okay, and so if you were to reread that analysis, you would kind of see that. Okay, the next sentence I'm going to highlight, I'm going to highlight that in pink. It says, additionally, the American value of justice is also seen in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Okay, that is now my transition to example number 2. I'm going to get back to my green highlighter here though, because of course, before you actually get to your example number 2, you have to give context. So let's look at it. When a Southern aristocrat Sherburne murders Boggs, the town drunk, the townspeople group up into a mob that is bent on exacting vigilante justice through lynching. Upon first glance, the mob might seem righteous enough, seeking an eye for an eye justice. However, when the mob approaches, Sherburne tames them into a silent audience as he lectures them about the failure of Southern justice. Okay, so again, this here is all context for example 2. Okay. And then down here, okay, I'm going to underline this sentence here because everything in this sentence, okay, is my contextual lead-in. And again, that kind of ties into my form of quote integration, which, by the way, if we were to look at it, okay, when the mob approaches, Sherburne tames them into a silent audience as he lectures them about the failure of Southern justice. Technically, that's a sentence on its own, so my form of quote integration is an independent clause with a colon. Remember that an independent clause requires a colon with it. A dependent clause, something like Sherburne says, would require a comma. Okay, notice too that my first form of quote integration was not an independent clause with a colon. You see that? Instead, it was just kind of part of my sentence. Down here, I used a different form of quote integration, and that's important. Make sure that you're not just using the same form of quote integration every single time. Okay, so there's my quote integration. After I actually give a contextual lead-in, at that point, then I give my actual quote. So why don't your juries hang murderers? Because they're afraid the man's friends will shoot them in the back in the dark. And that's just what they would do. Okay, so just a reminder again, we have a quote number 2. It is okay to have 2 quotes per paragraph or even 3 quotes per paragraph. I'm okay with that. But just remember that you have to at least have 1. And then over here, of course, I have my parenthetical citation with author's last name and page number. After your quote itself, we get back to analysis. Sherburne lectures the mob about their unrighteous intentions in seeking what they call justice. He mentions that the actual courts are extremely flawed because the juries are afraid of the vigilante justice response. Of course, that's what lynching is, killing outside of the law. Through Sherburne, Mark Twain makes his point that informal justice is not true justice. And I'm going to stop there. Okay. This part, again, is analysis of example number 2. Okay. And one thing I think is important, too, is you notice that I pulled little pieces of the quote out. In particular, I pulled out the word justice there. In fact, that's a really good thing to do. Using bits and pieces of the overall quote within your analysis, that's a good thing to do because that is what analysis is, as we've talked about in class. Okay, so there's the analysis for example number 2. Finally, I've got something else to highlight here. I'm going to do that in purple because it's kind of similar to what I had in pink. Okay. Okay, so it was Mark Twain makes his point that informal justice is not true justice, which further emphasizes that Americans do actually value true justice, which includes justice for all. What I'm doing here is I'm transitioning to my next paragraph or idea. How do I know that? Because it says includes justice for all. So I've mentioned what I have been talking about, and now it's very clear that I'm going to be moving and talking about something else, justice for all. And if you look at the next topic sentence, notice what we're talking about individuality of all persons and seeking equality through just treatment. Okay, so that would be a transition from one body paragraph to the next, or a transition from one idea to the next. All right, so the next body paragraph I have there is essentially the same thing as the first body paragraph I showed you that really just lists the pieces of a body paragraph. So now let's just move on to the last paragraph that I should see, and that is your conclusion. So there are really just two things that I want to see in your conclusion. So let's read through this together. It says, I'll start my conclusion with a restatement of my thesis statement in different words. Okay, so the first thing you need is a restatement of your thesis. It's also important to note that I'm saying use different words. You can't just do a copy-paste job from the last sentence of your intro to the first sentence of your conclusion. Like I said, it's important to use different words here. It's not a copy-paste job. Also, it's important to notice that I didn't start my conclusion with the words in conclusion, in closing, or any other cliche writing term that makes writers sound like they're in second grade. You guys know me well enough to know how much I hate that, so please do not start your conclusion with one of those cliche phrases. You do not need to indicate that it's your conclusion. I know visually that it's your conclusion because it's the last paragraph, okay? Finally, I'll close out my essay with some sort of insight, okay? So that's the second thing I need to see is insight. The insight includes kind of why this matters, what is the lesson to be learned, etc. So again, you want to ask yourself the question, why did my teacher give me this particular prompt? What am I supposed to gain from this ultimately over, the course of the semester? What am I supposed to have learned from this? And remember, your teacher did not give you this assignment just to make you suffer or to make life difficult for you. There is a point. Why did I give this particular prompt? Okay, a really good way to end your essay is by returning to what you used as a hook in your introduction paragraph. Okay, so this is not necessarily mandatory, so I'm going to put this as a 2.5 here, but that will wow your reader, and it's certainly really cool when you start with a really good hook if you return back to it and kind of emphasize a certain point or bring new meaning to that hook. Okay, so overall, this is what I'd like to see in your essay. Hopefully this stuff is not new information for you and that you are pretty comfortable with this, with these skills. Okay, but that's all I have for you right now.